Jake Williams was a simple man, the kind of man who enjoyed the quiet of the Montana wilderness, the soft rustling of the wind against the tall grasses, and the steady beat of hooves on the dusty trails. His life was solitary, by choice, perhaps, but also by necessity. Living in a remote cabin on the outskirts of the nearest town, he had found comfort in his 3 loyal dogs: Rex, the sturdy German shepherd who had served with Jake for years; Buddy, a golden retriever with a heart as golden as his fur; and Scout, a quick-witted border collie who was always one step ahead of the pack. Jake had come to rely on his dogs for more than just companionship. They were his family. The quiet mornings spent tending to the land, the evenings around the fire, and the long days of work were always made more bearable with their company. They were more than just animals. They were his friends, his confidants, and in many ways the only connection he had to the world beyond the mountains. But one chilly spring morning, Jake's life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. It started with a faint sound, a high-pitched whinny that echoed through the valley, a cry of desperation that carried on the breeze. Jake paused for a moment, squinting into the distance, trying to locate the source. The wind was strong, but the sound was unmistakable. It was a foal, a baby horse, lost and alone. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his rifle and headed out in the direction of the cry, the dogs falling in line behind him. Rex led the way, his sharp instincts guiding him, while Buddy and Scout flanked the sides, each of them alert to the unknown threat that might be lurking nearby. As they neared a secluded corner of the valley, Jake saw the heartbreaking sight before him. There, beside the still body of its mother, lay a small, golden-colored Mustang Foal. Its legs were unsteady, its eyes wide with fear, and its body trembled from the cold. The mare had obviously died during childbirth, leaving the helpless foal to fend for itself in the harsh wilderness. Jake's heart clenched. He had no idea how long the foal had been alone, but it didn't matter. This was no time to hesitate. With the sun dipping low in the sky, Jake carefully approached the foal, his rifle lowered. He knew he had to act quickly. The foal's chances of surviving in the wild were slim at best, and the last thing Jake wanted was for this innocent creature to become prey for a predator. Gently, he lifted the tiny horse into his arms, cradling it as best he could. The foal nickered weakly, its head resting against Jake's chest. It was cold and weak, but it was alive. That was all that mattered. The journey back to the cabin was slow. The foal's fragile body nestled against Jake's chest as he walked, one step at a time. When they arrived, Rex, Buddy, and Scout immediately gathered around, sniffing the foal curiously. They weren't sure what to make of this new creature, but the bond between them was instant. Rex, ever the protector, gave the foal a gentle lick on the head, as if to say, "You're one of us now." Jake set the foal down in the barn, where the dogs circled it protectively. As he began preparing a bottle of formula to feed the foal, Rex kept a watchful eye on the new arrival. Buddy lay down beside the foal, sharing his warmth, while Scout darted around the barn, keeping alert for any potential danger. At that moment, Jake realized something extraordinary was happening. The dogs, his loyal companions, were accepting this helpless foal as one of their own. They were forming a bond with it, without question, without hesitation. It was as if they recognized that the foal was part of their pack, and they were determined to protect it. The foal, which Jake named Comet for the star-shaped white mark on its forehead, began to adapt to its new family. As the days went by, Jake couldn't help but marvel at how quickly Comet started imitating the dogs. It wasn't just the way the foal moved, though that was surprising enough. It was the way Comet seemed to understand the dog's behavior. When Rex barked at the approach of a vehicle, Comet would lift his head and attempt to bark as well, though it came out more like a strange, nicker-like sound. It wasn't quite a bark, but it was an attempt, a desperate effort to fit in, to be part of the pack. The dogs, for their part, seemed to take it all in stride. They accepted Comet's attempts to join in, and when Jake tossed a tennis ball for Buddy and Scout, Comet would gallop after it, awkwardly trying to pick it up with his mouth like a dog. It was a sight to behold, this tiny foal running beside the dogs, doing its best to play, to belong. At night, when the temperature dropped and the barn became cold, Comet no longer stood in the corner like a typical foal. Instead, he would curl up beside the dogs, snuggling against their warm bodies, and sleep in a pile with them. It was as if the foal had forgotten what it meant to be a horse, and had fully embraced the idea that it was, without question, part of the canine pack. Jake watched this strange, beautiful transformation with a mix of amusement and awe. The foal was no longer just an orphaned wild animal. It was a part of his family. It was more than that. Comet had become one of them. But there was something deeper happening here. Jake couldn't quite explain it, but he knew this wasn't just about saving a foal. It was about something bigger, something that reached beyond species, beyond nature, and spoke to the heart of what it meant to belong. As the days passed, Dr. Sarah Chen, the local veterinarian, came by to check on Comet. She was intrigued by the foal's strange behavior, noting that it was almost as though Comet didn't realize he was a horse. Dr. Chen had never seen anything like it. She began taking notes, documenting the foal's progress, and marveled at the bond between the foal and the dogs. She could tell that Comet wasn't confused. He simply knew that he was part of the pack. To him, it didn't matter whether he had 4 legs or 2, whether he barked or whinnied. All that mattered was love. And love, it seemed, was in abundant supply at Jake's cabin in the wilds of Montana. Little did they know that the journey they were beginning, Jake, Comet, and the 3 loyal dogs, would soon become a story that would change not just their lives, but the world's understanding of what it meant to belong. As the weeks went by, Jake couldn't help but notice how much Comet had grown. Not just in size, but in personality. The foal, now nearing 3 months old, had become fully integrated into the family dynamic. His days were spent following Rex, Buddy, and Scout on their daily routines, imitating their every move. There was something almost uncanny about the way Comet behaved. It was as if he had forgotten he was a Mustang, a wild creature of the plains, and had embraced the life of a dog, his loyal 4-legged siblings. Jake chuckled to himself as he watched Comet attempt to scratch behind his ears with his hind legs, mimicking Rex's precise movements. It wasn't a perfect imitation, of course. The foal was still too young and awkward to perform the dog-like stretch with any grace, but the effort was there. It was endearing, and Jake had long ago stopped questioning the strange connection that had developed between Comet and the dogs. In the mornings, Jake would let the dogs out to roam the property, and Comet would charge out with them, full of enthusiasm. While Rex, Buddy, and Scout would handle the daily tasks with purpose, Comet's approach was more carefree, like a puppy eager to join in on the fun. He would bound after the dogs, galloping along at a clumsy pace, his hooves clacking against the gravel path, while Scout would race ahead, always challenging him to keep up. At times, Jake couldn't help but wonder what was going through Comet's mind. Did he know he was different from the dogs? Did he realize he wasn't a dog at all? In his heart, Jake believed that Comet didn't care. To him, the pack was everything. The dogs were his family, and that was enough. Despite the comical antics, Jake couldn't deny the deeper connection that was forming between them all. As the weeks turned into months, Comet's behavior grew more sophisticated. He learned to bark, sort of. It wasn't a true bark like Rex's booming warning sound or Buddy's happy yelps. Instead, Comet's bark was a peculiar hybrid, a cross between a neigh and a bark, a sound that made Jake laugh every time. But there was more to it than just play. The foal had begun to display some surprising protective instincts. One afternoon, as Jake was tending to the garden, a delivery truck approached, its tires kicking up dust on the dirt road. The dogs immediately rushed to the gate, barking fiercely to alert Jake of the arrival. But Comet, without missing a beat, joined the chorus, trotting up alongside the dogs and mimicking their behavior. He stood tall, his head high, and his legs planted firmly as he let out a strange, combined bark and whinny. It was both comical and impressive. Jake had seen the delivery driver, Mike Thompson, many times before. But today, as he watched Mike's reaction to the unusual scene unfolding before him, he couldn't help but smile. Mike had delivered supplies to the ranch countless times, but he had never seen a foal behave like this before. He stopped his truck, staring at Comet in bewilderment. "Well, I'll be damned," Mike muttered under his breath as he stepped out of his truck. "A horse that thinks he's a dog?" Jake chuckled, walking over to the gate. "He certainly seems to think so." Mike shook his head, still trying to process the sight. "Well, whatever he is, he sure knows how to protect the place. Ain't no one getting by with him on watch." Jake nodded. "Yeah, he's a bit of a character, that's for sure." But the uniqueness of Comet's behavior wasn't limited to his interactions with the dogs. It extended to his relationship with Jake. Over the next few weeks, Comet began to follow Jake around more closely, almost as if he were trying to learn his every move. If Jake went out to the barn, Comet would trot beside him, keeping pace. If Jake worked in the garden, Comet would stand nearby, watching attentively. It was as though the foal had formed an attachment to Jake, just as strong as the one he had with the dogs. Jake marveled at the bond they shared, and it wasn't long before he started to think of Comet as his own, part of his family, in a way he had never expected. The foal had brought something new to the ranch, something that filled the lonely spaces of Jake's life. Where he had once been content with the company of his dogs, now he felt that the ranch was a true home. Comet, in his own way, had become the missing piece, the living embodiment of companionship and love. But even as Jake's attachment to Comet deepened, there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. He knew that Comet's future was uncertain. He wasn't just a regular horse. He had been raised by dogs, and that had changed him in ways Jake couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just his behavior that was unusual, it was his identity. Comet was a Mustang Foal, a wild creature born to roam the plains, and yet he had no concept of what that meant. To Comet, his family was Rex, Buddy, and Scout. He had no understanding of his place in the natural world. That uncertainty weighed heavily on Jake. He loved Comet like he loved his dogs, but he knew that one day Comet would have to face the reality of who he was. How would he react when he met other horses? Would he recognize that he was different, or would he continue to believe that he was just another dog in the pack? The first inkling of an answer came when Dr. Sarah Chen, the local veterinarian, paid a visit to check on Comet's progress. Dr. Chen had been fascinated by the foal's behavior since the day Jake had brought him home. She had observed the bond between Comet and the dogs, but today she wanted to dig deeper. "Jake," she said, as she took her seat in the small kitchen, "I've been thinking about Comet's behavior. It's unlike anything I've seen before. I think you might need to start considering the possibility that Comet doesn't know he's a horse." Jake frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "Well, it's clear that Comet sees himself as part of the dog pack. He's imprinted on them. He's learned their behaviors, their signals, even their social structure. And to him, that's normal. He doesn't know he's supposed to be a horse. I've been watching him, and it's as though he thinks he's one of the dogs, not an equine. Jake absorbed her words in silence. He had never thought of it that way before. So, what does that mean for him? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. Dr. Chen paused before speaking carefully. It means that Comet may never fully understand what it means to be a horse. He may never feel comfortable in his own skin, and eventually that's going to create some challenges, especially when he meets other horses. Jake's heart sank at the thought. What should I do? I'm not sure yet, Dr. Chen replied, but I think it's important that you start thinking about his future. He can't stay here forever, living with the dogs. Eventually, he'll need to meet other horses, and when that happens, we'll have to help him navigate his identity. But for now, let him be who he is. Let him continue to learn from the dogs. Jake nodded, even as a wave of uncertainty washed over him. He didn't know what the future held for Comet, but one thing was clear. He would do whatever it took to help this extraordinary foal find his place in the world. As the day wore on, Jake found himself watching Comet from the porch, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the journey ahead would be a difficult one. Comet was part of the pack, and Jake couldn't help but wonder how that bond would be tested when the time came for Comet to confront the reality of who he truly was. But as the sun set over the rugged Montana landscape, casting a golden glow over the land, Jake felt a sense of peace. For now, Comet was home. And that was enough. It had been a few weeks since Jake and Comet had discussed the foal's strange behavior. With Dr. Chen's words echoing in his mind, Jake knew that a day would eventually come when Comet would have to face other horses. That day came sooner than expected. Jake was working outside the barn one afternoon, stacking hay bales when he noticed a disturbance in the distance. It started with a few distant whinnies, followed by the unmistakable sound of hooves. He squinted toward the horizon, where a small herd of wild mustangs appeared at the edge of his property. They were led by a striking bay stallion, with a mane that seemed to shimmer in the wind, a symbol of freedom and untamed beauty. Comet, who had been grazing near the fence with Buddy and Scout, perked up at the sounds. His head shot up, his ears swiveling toward the approaching herd, confusion painting his expression. Rex and Buddy both raised their hackles, sensing the unfamiliar presence, but it was Scout who was the first to bark, alerting Jake to the situation. Jake quickly wiped his hands on his jeans, standing still for a moment to watch the scene unfold. This was the moment he had dreaded, Comet's first interaction with other horses. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the image of his foal trying to mimic dog behaviors with wild mustangs was hard to shake. As the wild herd moved closer, Comet trotted up to the fence. The dogs, sensing his hesitation, took their positions around him, Rex in front, Buddy on his left, and Scout beside him. The dogs had grown accustomed to standing guard, but today felt different. Jake could feel a tension in the air, a kind of electricity. The wild mustang stopped at the edge of the pasture, watching with curiosity. The bay stallion at the head of the group snorted, his dark eyes fixed on Comet. There was an intense moment of silence before Comet, with his usual enthusiasm, bounded forward, his hooves clattering against the ground. But instead of the typical horse approach, graceful, measured, and respectful, Comet attempted something entirely different. He trotted to the group of horses, his body language a curious mix of excitement and uncertainty, his head lowered in a play bow, just like Scout would when meeting a new dog. He was trying to engage, but in a way that no horse would understand. Jake held his breath, watching as the wild horses took in this bizarre display. The bay stallion snorted again, pawing at the ground. The mares in the herd seemed confused, backing away slightly, while the younger foals watched in silence. Comet, undeterred, pranced around in circles, wagging his tail like a dog, offering a strange mix of nuzzles and barks. The wild mustangs exchanged looks, unsure how to respond. Jake couldn't help but laugh quietly at the absurdity of the situation. He had never imagined that one day he would see a foal raised by dogs try to play with a wild herd of mustangs. It was a spectacle, one that would surely go down in ranching folklore. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that the situation was becoming more tense. The wild horses weren't exactly comfortable with Comet's dog-like behavior. They began to stomp their hooves and snort, the stallion stepping forward with more authority, his posture becoming more dominant. Comet, however, was still trying to act like one of the pack. He turned to Rex for guidance, as he always did, his head cocked in confusion. Jake noticed the shift in the herd's energy. The wild stallion took another step closer, his nostrils flaring as he sized up the foal. Comet, ever the optimist, took a few tentative steps forward, reaching out to sniff the stallion's flank. But instead of a friendly greeting, the stallion reacted sharply, raising his head and snapping his teeth in warning. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was a clear sign the stallion was trying to assert his dominance. Comet, confused and unaware of the horse's intent, tried to respond by lowering his head to initiate play, but the stallion snorted angrily and turned his back. Comet paused, stepping back. His behavior shifted from playful to defensive. He glanced to the side at Rex, who was standing firm, watching the stallion closely. The pack leader's growl was low, almost imperceptible, but enough to communicate that he wasn't going to let anything happen to Comet. Buddy and Scout flanked Comet, their eyes scanning the wild horses, ready to protect. The situation was becoming more tense by the second. Comet had never encountered such an assertive horse before, and it was clear he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. His ears flattened back against his head, a sign of distress, but he didn't run. Instead, he stood frozen, his body stiff, unsure of how to respond. The stallion, sensing this vulnerability, took another step forward. He bared his teeth again, this time with more intent. Comet, instinctively trying to protect himself, let out a strange, half bark, half neigh, as if calling for help. Jake took a step forward, but before he could intervene, something remarkable happened. Rex, always the protector, growled louder, his hackles raised as he stepped in between Comet and the wild stallion. Buddy and Scout joined him, their presence creating a barrier. Comet, in that moment, looked up at his canine siblings, finding comfort in their familiar protection. He whinnied softly, his body relaxing just a bit as he understood that he wasn't alone. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. The wild mustangs had backed off, the stallion hesitating as he saw the unwavering unity of the pack. Rex stood tall, his eyes locked with the stallion's, a clear challenge in his posture. The mustangs, realizing they couldn't easily breach this unusual formation, began to turn away, the herd following their leader in retreat. Comet, still unsure of what had just transpired, trotted after the retreating mustangs for a few steps, looking back at his dog family. The pack didn't move. They stayed firmly in place, watching the mustangs leave. The wild stallion let out one final snort before disappearing over the ridge with the rest of the herd. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He walked toward Comet, who was still standing at the fence, staring at the spot where the mustangs had been moments ago. There was a mixture of confusion and longing in the foal's eyes. Jake knelt down beside him, running a hand through the foal's mane. "You did good, Comet," Jake said quietly, offering the foal a gentle pat. "You really did." Comet whinnied softly in response, nuzzling Jake's shoulder. It was as if he was trying to ask a question Jake couldn't quite answer. But Jake understood. Comet hadn't found his place among the wild Mustangs, but he had found something more important. He had found his pack, his family, and no matter how different they were, they would always have each other. As the weeks passed since Comet's encounter with the wild Mustangs, Jake noticed a shift in the foal. It wasn't just his size. Comet was growing fast, his once gangly legs now strong and steady. It was his behavior that had changed. Despite the miscommunication with the wild horses, Comet was more determined than ever to find his place in the world. But where exactly did he fit? Jake had always known that Comet was something special. But as the foal continued to grow, Jake began to see the complexities of his adopted family's relationship. The three dogs, Rex, Buddy, and Scout, had accepted Comet as one of their own, guiding him through life with all the loyalty and love they could offer. Yet Jake knew deep down that Comet couldn't stay forever in the world of dogs. He was a horse after all, and he needed to learn how to communicate with other horses to find his true identity. It was a hard truth for Jake to swallow. He had watched Comet interact with the dogs like they were his true family, and it had been comforting. But the time had come for Comet to learn what it meant to be a horse. The question was, how? Dr. Sarah Chen had been monitoring Comet's behavior closely, making note of how his dog-like traits were slowly but surely being overshadowed by his growing physical abilities. His horse instincts, though not fully developed, were emerging. Yet his confusion about his identity was still evident, and there was no easy fix. "Jake, it's time," Dr. Chen said one afternoon as she stood next to the fence, watching Comet try to leap into the doghouse once again. "He needs to learn from a horse. He needs a teacher, not just any horse, but one with the patience to show him how to be what he truly is." Jake, feeling the weight of the decision, agreed. He had been putting it off, but deep down he knew Doctor. Chen was right. Comet needed a mentor, someone who could teach him what Jake, as much as he loved the foal, couldn't. That's when she introduced him to Gentle Ben. Gentle Ben was an elderly quarter horse known throughout the region for his calm demeanor and experience with troubled animals. He had worked with countless horses over the years, teaching, guiding, and showing them the way. Gentle Ben wasn't just any horse. He was patient, wise, and slow to anger, making him the perfect choice to help Comet navigate the complicated path from dog-like foal to wild Mustang. When Jake first saw Gentle Ben, he knew immediately that this horse was special. His graying coat, gentle eyes, and slow, deliberate movements told a story of experience and understanding that Jake couldn't ignore. Ben wasn't just a teacher, he was a healer. The first meeting between Comet and Gentle Ben was carefully orchestrated. Dr. Chen had arranged it so that Comet would meet Ben in the most controlled, calm environment possible. No distractions, no rushing, just two beings, one young and confused, the other old and wise, on the path to understanding each other. Jake stood quietly at the edge of the paddock, watching as Comet and Gentle Ben approached each other. For a moment the foal paused, sensing something different about this new horse. It wasn't the same as the wild Mustangs he had encountered. This horse wasn't going to challenge him or turn him away. Instead, Ben stood still, lowering his head slightly, offering Comet the chance to come closer. Comet, still unsure, took a few tentative steps forward, his body language tentative and curious. His tail flicked slightly, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. But then, as if guided by an invisible pull, he moved closer to Ben, sniffing at his coat. Gentle Ben didn't flinch. He allowed Comet to explore, offering no resistance. The foal, feeling the calmness radiating from the older horse, took another step closer. He nudged Ben's side with his nose, and for the first time, Comet felt something that was unfamiliar, but deeply comforting. He felt a connection to another horse, not just a dog. Ben didn't speak, but his presence was more powerful than words could ever be. Slowly, with a calm nicker, he lowered his head and touched Comet's nose with his own. It was a greeting, a recognition of each other's existence. For the first time, Comet was meeting another horse on his level, and the shift in the foal was immediate. Jake watched the scene with a mixture of awe and relief. His heart swelled as he saw the bond beginning to form between the two. He knew this was just the beginning, but it felt like a momentous first step. Over the next few days, Comet and Gentle Ben spent hours together in the paddock, moving through the motions of horse interactions. Gentle Ben showed Comet how to graze properly, how to position himself when standing near other horses, how to communicate through small movements and body language. It was slow, painstaking work, but Comet responded with curiosity, trying to mimic Ben's movements, even when they were new to him. There were moments of frustration, of course. Comet would still try to play fetch with Ben, throwing a stick at the older horse's hooves and waiting for him to retrieve it. But Ben, wise beyond his years, would simply nudge the stick away and continue grazing. Slowly, Comet began to understand that not everything had to be a game, that being a horse meant having patience and understanding. One of the most challenging moments came when Ben introduced Comet to the concept of the nicker, the soft horse sound that communicates a variety of emotions, from greeting to reassurance. It wasn't easy for Comet. The sound felt foreign to him, and his attempts to produce it were awkward at best. His voice cracked, the pitch faltering, a strange hybrid of a whinny and a bark. But Ben was patient, never rushing him. And with time, Comet's nickers began to sound more and more like a true horse's. It was a breakthrough, a sign that Comet was learning to bridge the gap between the dog world and the horse world. But it wasn't just about sound. It was about finding his voice, his identity, and a place where he truly belonged. The breakthrough moment came one crisp morning when Comet, standing in the middle of the paddock, looked at Ben and let out a deep, clear nicker, one that didn't sound like a bark or a hybrid of any kind. It was pure and unmistakable. Jake stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the scene unfold before him, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's it, buddy," Jake whispered to himself. "You're starting to find your way." But it wasn't just the sound that made the difference. It was the way Comet interacted with Ben, how he no longer saw himself as a dog, but as a horse, a part of something bigger than himself, something more grounded, more natural. Gentle Ben had done his job, but there was still so much for Comet to learn. The months that followed Comet's first real introduction to the world of horses brought new challenges and growth. While Gentle Ben's influence helped guide him, there were still moments where Comet seemed torn between his old canine habits and his newfound understanding of what it meant to be a horse. Jake had hoped that time would gradually push Comet further into the world of horses, but what he didn't expect was how deeply the foal had imprinted on the dogs. It wasn't an easy thing to break away from the pack when it had been his foundation, his family, for so long. But there were other signs that Comet was changing. Slowly, the foal was learning how to be a part of the herd. He still enjoyed playing fetch, still loved running at top speed with the dogs, but he was starting to understand horse language. Gentle Ben had helped him tremendously, but the foal's natural instincts were beginning to take over. Jake had come to accept that Comet was going to be a hybrid of sorts, a blend of horse and dog behaviors. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it made Comet unique. Jake saw it in the way the foal greeted the other horses, no longer just bouncing on his front legs like a dog, but walking up to them in a more confident, horse-like manner. There was something profound in his presence, something different that made the horses respect him. One day, while watching Comet interact with the herd, Jake had a thought that lingered in his mind. Maybe Comet's path was to help others find their way, just as he had done. "Jake, you should see this," Dr. Sarah Chen called out as she stood near the barn with her clipboard. "Come here." Jake walked over and saw Comet standing next to a small group of wild Mustangs, their eyes wide as they looked at the foal. He could see that the other horses were confused, unsure of how to react. Comet didn't seem to notice. He was acting like he always had, circling them with his tail wagging as if he were playing a game. "That's remarkable," Dr. Chen said, jotting down more notes. "He's acting like he belongs here." Jake was quiet, watching the scene unfold. He saw how Comet was different, and it was clear now that he wasn't just imitating dogs. He was becoming something else entirely. Jake didn't know what to call it, but he felt in his gut that Comet's purpose wasn't just to fit into the horse world, but to bridge the gap between species. He had an undeniable ability to communicate, to bring animals together in a way that no one had ever seen before. As Jake pondered this, he heard a rustling sound coming from the direction of the barn. Rex, his loyal German shepherd, had been lying in the shade, but now he was struggling to stand. The old dog's body was stiff, and his movements seemed uncoordinated. Jake's heart sank. "Rex?" he whispered, walking toward the dog. "What's wrong, buddy?" Rex didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking up at Jake with tired eyes. Jake crouched down, stroking the dog's fur gently. Rex's once vibrant energy had faded, and there was something in his gaze that told Jake the truth. His old protector wasn't well. Over the next few days, Rex grew weaker. Jake tried everything he could think of, reaching out to Dr. Chen for advice and assistance, but the aging German shepherd was no longer able to stand on his own for long periods of time. His joints ached, and his once strong body was beginning to fail him. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake sat in the barn with Rex by his side, Comet lying nearby. The dogs, Buddy and Scout, were lying down on the floor, content and calm, as if they somehow knew what was happening. Jake knew what he had to do, but it was the hardest decision of his life. "Comet," Jake said softly, looking at the foal. "You've come a long way, little one. You're ready now. You're ready to help others." Comet lifted his head and whinnied, a soft sound that had become familiar over the past few months. He seemed to understand, his big brown eyes reflecting something Jake couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just a horse's gaze. It was the gaze of a creature who knew his role in the world, who had found a purpose beyond the confines of species. And then, as Jake sat there, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. Rex had taught Comet more than any dog ever could. He had given the foal the ability to protect, to care, to lead. The love Rex had shown Comet had shaped him into a unique creature, one that was as much dog as horse, but Comet had something Rex could never have, the ability to bridge worlds. The next day, Jake called the sanctuary in Wyoming. The conversation was brief but meaningful. The director of the sanctuary had heard about Comet's abilities and wanted him to visit. They had several orphaned foals who weren't bonding with their surrogate mothers, and they thought Comet could help. It was a big opportunity, one that could change everything for the foal and for the sanctuary. "I think it's time," Jake said quietly, rubbing Rex's head. "Time for you to go help someone else." Jake made the arrangements, and a few days later he loaded Comet into the trailer. Rex, weak but still aware, gave a low bark as the foal left the ranch. Comet's tail wagged, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Buddy and Scout stood by Jake, their eyes reflecting a sadness that matched his own. The drive to Wyoming was long, but Comet's behavior remained calm. The journey was filled with stops, as Jake gave the foal plenty of time to adjust to the trailer ride. During each stop, Comet would look out the window, his gaze meeting the dogs in Jake's truck behind them. Sometimes he'd bark a greeting to them, but mostly he seemed to be processing the change in his world. At the sanctuary, Comet was introduced to the orphaned foals. These young horses were hesitant, scared of the world and the humans around them. But Comet's presence had an immediate effect. The foals seemed to be drawn to him, not in the way they would be drawn to a mother or another horse, but with a sense of familiarity. They watched Comet carefully, as if unsure how to interact with him. Comet responded in the only way he knew how, by playing. He dropped to the ground and rolled onto his back, just like the dogs had taught him. The foals, hesitant at first, slowly approached him, drawn by the strange but comforting behavior. Comet's playful demeanor broke through their fear, and soon they were following him around, watching as he rolled, played, and even tried to engage them in tug-of-war games. Jake stood in the distance, watching with pride. This was it. This was Comet's true purpose. He wasn't just a dog who thought he was a horse. He was a bridge, a connector, a creature who could teach both horses and humans the power of patience, understanding, and love. But as the days passed, Jake noticed a subtle change in Comet. The more time he spent with the foals, the less he exhibited the behaviors of a dog. His whinnies became more natural, his posture more confident. Slowly, Comet was becoming the horse he was always meant to be. It was a bittersweet moment when Jake received the call from the sanctuary. The foals, once withdrawn and fearful, had begun to thrive under Comet's guidance. They were interacting with each other, playing, grazing, and bonding with the humans. The director wanted to keep Comet at the sanctuary permanently. It was a significant offer, one that could change the future of rehabilitation programs for orphaned horses. But Jake knew he couldn't keep Comet forever. He had a family waiting for him back home, and Rex, though nearing the end of his life, still needed him. "I'll bring him home," Jake said softly, staring out at the peaceful horizon. "He belongs with us." Comet returned to the ranch, a little older, a little wiser. But what had stayed with him even after all this time was his bond with the dogs. That bond wasn't just about species. It was about love, about protection, and about the shared language that had connected them all. Rex, though older and weaker, stood at the edge of the paddock as Comet returned. The old German shepherd gave a tired but proud bark, and Comet trotted over to him. They nuzzled each other gently, a silent understanding passing between them. It was time for a new chapter. Comet had found his purpose, and the pack, both the dogs and the horses, had found their place in the world together.